This is Hannibal here from thehannibaltv.com, and today is my special guest. We have Ed Wheatley, who is the author of numerous books and actually has been involved in some film productions as well. And him and Herb Simmons, who's a St. Louis pro wrestling promoter, the promoter of Southern Illinois Championship Wrestling, and he's actually going to get the Bruiser Brody Lifetime Achievement Award in November at the Bruiser Brody Cup in Carthage, Texas, which was just announced today. So that's pretty impressive. But thanks for joining me, you two. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Glad to be here.
Doing good, Hannibal. I appreciate you giving us the platform here because, as I tell everybody, you got the number one show out there going, and the viewers. And if you want to know anything about pro wrestling, you got to watch Hannibal.
There you go. And you are the promoter of Southern Illinois Championship Wrestling, and of course, you own a lot of that classic St. Louis footage, which you've let me post some of it already on this channel, and I think there's going to be some more to come. But why don't we start by telling us a little bit about the history of you and St. Louis wrestling and what made you want to do this book with Ed?
Well, I've been promoting for 47 years this last February, and I had the extreme honor of being around Sam Muchnick, former NWA president, for many years, sitting in the office with him and Larry Matasek, my dear late friend, who introduced me to Sam. And of course, I, like all of us, grew up as a fan, and they introduced me to all the greats, and I've got to work with all of them. As you can see over my shoulder there is Sam and Larry Matasek, and of course, my dear late friend, Bruiser Brody. So it's one of those deals where I just love the business, and I've been promoting and do quite a few fundraisers for nonprofit organizations and help them raise funds. But, wrestling in St. Louis was always considered the hub of professional wrestling. Everybody wanted to come to St. Louis, and that's been documented by many of the all-time greats in the books that they've written or been a part of, and the ones that I've talked to. Larry Matasek wrote a book on wrestling at the Chase. I helped him with that. And so when Ed, and I think he'll tell you that story too, when him and his publisher first approached me, I was like, that's already been done. But it took me one meeting with Ed and saw his other books that he had won awards for, and I saw the passion and the drive he had for his writing. It just showed me that this coffee table book is going to just complement what Larry's did and even go farther into the St. Louis wrestling. So Ed, I think with that, if you just let Hannibal's viewers know what they can expect in this book.
Well, when I write a book, I like to go back in time so that this is something we remember. I've written a lot of books, mainly baseball, where I have relived the time, but I do it in a way with like a coffee table type book. It's loaded with little vignette stories, and then hundreds and hundreds of photos. Sometimes there's 400 to 700 photos that sometimes we have a vignette and we get the photos that support it, or we have a photo and then we tell the story. And, whether it's a former baseball team or the wrestling at the Chase, there is a tremendous history that should not be forgotten. Generations, love this. They sat down for, it was on over 2 decades. And, it's not just St. Louisans. This is a thing that crossed the country. These wrestlers were from across the country. We see, the evolution of the WWE and all that on television and cable. But most of that would never have happened without Sam Muchnick and wrestling at the Chase. And what Sam did here in St. Louis, as Herb eloquently said, for many decades, he was the president of the NWA, and he was headquartered out of St. Louis. St. Louis was the wrestling capital of the world, just through that fact. So, I go back at the beginning. How did professional wrestling evolve? I mean, we can go back in time and look to the Egyptians, to the Babylonians, the ancient Chinese 4,000 years ago. If you study their history, you'll find drawings, mosaics etchings of people wrestling, and then it evolved to the Greeks and the Romans and the Olympics. But, wrestling was always that Greco-Roman style until 1904. In 1904, the World's Fair was held in St. Louis, Forest Park, just across the street. I mean, how ironic is this? Just across the street from the Chase Hotel, which becomes the focus of this book and the television program, is where the 1904 Olympics were held. That's the first time they had freestyle wrestling in the Olympics. And then from there through, the 1900s and the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, the advent of vaudeville. And as people became more of the, swinging Roaring Twenties, they wanted a little more action of different types. That influenced professional wrestling. And we cover that briefly all the way up until the 40s when the NWA was formed. And we brought all these territories into this structured format. And it really then is what exploded across the country with this one NWA champion shared by all the territories. Who were the men? Who were the people? It was all guided by, Sam Muchnick, from 1950 up into the 80s. And, that is how it all plays out. Who were the greats? We talked about Brody there over Herb's shoulders, and we had Dick the Bruiser. We had Lou Thez, Pat O'Connor. I mean, I can go on and tell you, hey, read the book, you'll see them all. But it's to bring them, the men, the women, to you, back to the memory. When you used to watch television, it was this big old box with a little tiny screen and the black and white fuzziness, how the stories and their memories, how, people were forced to go to early church so their parents could be back home to watch the replay on Sunday mornings. I mean, we have so many stories that we can talk about tonight, but I mean, that's just it's something special. It's fantastic memories. When people said, what are you working on? I said, wrestling at the Chase, kind of humbly. And then all of a sudden there was an explosion, no matter what part of the country, who I was talking to, whether it was a famous wrestler, a famous broadcaster, or just Joe Public. They all have so much memories because that was the only show really in town. It had started up in Chicago. It came down here into St. Louis on television, and we explore how that all came to be and set the stage for wrestling as it is today.
Well, and one thing, Ed, a lot of the fans know the wrestling at the Chase started on television in 1959, and lo and behold, the first play-by-play announcer was Joe Garagiola.
Yes, Joe Garagiola, local hometown boy, made it to the Hall of Fame as a broadcaster, played 9 years in the major leagues. And, it's these interviews with a guy like Joe Garagiola. Joe Garagiola grew up about 1.5 miles down Kings Highway, the street that Chase Park Plaza is. And he grew up across the street from another Hall of Famer with the Yankees, Yogi Berra. But Joe would talk about him and his family would drive up and down Kings Highway, the street there in St. Louis on the edge of Forest Park, and they would pass the most opulent hotel in the city, the Chase Park Plaza. And they would say, if we could only win the lottery, we could go in one day. It was the place to be. Men and women would come. Kings, queens, presidents would stay there. The Chase Club was one of the top 5 nightclubs in America. It was regularly playing in the Chase Club would be Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Nat King Cole, Rosemary Clooney, Dean Martin. I can name them all. And they did. And I actually have the autographed programs from all these people in the book as I tell the tale. It was the place to be. And then when wrestling at the Chase, the owner of the Chase created one of the first independent television stations in America, KPLR TV 11. And it was out of his television and his hotel that Sam Muchnick brought wrestling. And people just didn't come initially to watch. When you see the films of wrestling at the Chase, these are men and women dressed to the nine, women in evening gloves and formal gowns and pearl necklaces, all ringside screaming and hollering for blood. And so, when the guy would tell his date, I got tickets to the Chase, the hottest ticket. She might think initially it's Frank Sinatra. No, the hottest ticket was wrestling at the Chase. And that is part of this, how all of a sudden that was then beamed into the homes of all these people across the Midwest that could never, ever go to the hotel. But now they sat every Saturday night or Sunday morning when it was re-aired and watched the show.
Well, and you talked about Channel 11. I don't know if you can see it there, but it's one of the pendulums that we found. It's in the book also, and it's got KPLR TV Channel 11. And then on the backside, it says, admit one bearer wrestling at the Chase with their guest. And like Ed, we've talked about it. Ed, that's probably the only one that's left out there that we know of.
How much would tickets have been? You mentioned the fancy outfits and the high class people that watched wrestling, as Herb probably knows. Generally, it's a lot of low income. There are higher class that go, but for the most part, it's usually middle class to lower income. Would those people still be able to go to the Chase, or was the tickets price so high that it would pretty much have to be upper class people to afford them?
If you're sitting down, the answer is they were free. You just had to get them. And there was a list, but it usually went to those who had connections. As Joe Gargiola said, these are the closet wrestling fans. They are there. Doctors, lawyers, the who's who of the Midwest would somehow be ringside, and everybody else would be, at home watching it. But it is amazing. They were free, and it was kind of like Saturday Night Live in New York. The wait list for those that would sit a little further back to get in, it could be 6 months long or more. I mean, this was must-see TV before, the catchphrase came in the 2000s of must-see TV. This was the thing. But the irony of it is great question, that it was free, actually. You just had to hope you got on the list. And like I said, Gargiola called them closet fans because these are people that, they were there because they wanted to see wrestling, but they also wanted to be seen. And, the tales of, these elegantly dressed men and women, and, whether it was sweat or spit, from the rain kind of flying out on them, they loved it.
Well, Hannibal, in one of the that deal between Sam Muchnick and Harold Koppler actually took place on an airplane. Am I right, Ed?
That is correct. They were both coming back to St. Louis on a flight, and they sat next to each other. They kind of had an acquaintance. And Harold Koppler had this fledgling, brand new, independent television station, and he's looking for programming. And Sam Muchnick, they had wrestling at the Marigold coming from Chicago, as we spoke about earlier. How can we get more wrestling, special local wrestling live in St. Louis? And that is what I call in the book, that airplane flight was an engagement, as they engaged this discussion. And then wrestling at the Chase became a 34-year-old marriage. And that's how it really all came together. And it was one of the highest rated shows in St. Louis. Only the St. Louis Cardinals and the local news had higher ratings.
Very interesting. And before I go any further, this gentleman seems to really want to buy your book, and he's wondering how much is the book and where can they buy it?
Okay. The book is like $39 from our publisher. It comes out October 1st. We've been working dates. As you know, this pandemic has impacted a lot of the factories. We feel that it will be here for sure. We've been working with the printers for October 1st is the target. And, you can pre-order it today at STL Wrestling Book. That's STLWrestlingBook.com. Or, it will be out October 1st for sure. But you can pre-order it today. And I'll tell you what, the pre-orders are going crazy as people are hearing about, because it just, everybody's got a story throughout. Whether it was someone who lived 100 miles from St. Louis, they would have their antenna pointed up towards Champaign, Urbana, Chicago area. But on Saturday nights, Grandma would make them go out there with the pliers and turn the antenna to St. Louis so she could get a fuzzy picture of wrestling at the Chase. Or, we have people telling stories of their 90-year-old grandmothers that would be watching TV with them on Saturday nights as she lived with them. But at time for wrestling at Chase, she would go into her bedroom, shut the door, turn on her own TV. They would hear her soon thereafter hollering and screaming and getting a little cursive, if you will. they would go in, open the door to check on grandma, and she'd be down on all four knees doing counting out, just like the referee counting out the wrestler. And that, we have the great stories from the wrestlers themselves who participated in these years, but we also have the memories and stories of the fans. Whether it was the fans themselves or the people who lived with their parents and grandparents and such. So again, you can get it reserved, stlwrestlingbook.com. And we'll be passing on to Hannibal as we get closer to October, more information on ordering and how to do that. And, great Christmas present. I can say it right now in the summer. Put it on your Christmas list.
Lou Thez, of course, had a big role with the whole Wrestling at the Chase television show and events in the St. Louis area. Do you guys have any memories of him? And I know Herb must have met him a few times, but have you met him as well?
Well, I did not meet him, but I have constant memories of him growing up as a child. He was one of those, kind of wrestling equivalent of a Babe Ruth. He was, he had been around for decades. How many world championships has he won? He was kind of an early face of professional wrestling as that champion. Herb, I'll give you your thoughts.
Yeah, Lou never wrestled for me, but he did special guest referee appearances for me. In fact, 6 months before he passed away, he was at the Bel Air Fairgrounds, where we'll be going back to later this year for a big show. He refereed a match there, and one of the great memories I have was him and Bruiser Brody. I had the entire fairgrounds building at that time booked, and they had the Japanese photographers over. They were working a big angle in Japan, and they had actually sent the Japanese photographers over here. And Brody, and it was myself and Larry Matisek sitting in the front row, and we watched Lou Thez and Brody get in and roll around in the ring for about 45 minutes. And I mean, it was one of the most memorable moments I had of them guys. And the only thing that really topped that is when they got out of the ring, Lou walked over and he took a folding chair, put it up against the wall, and did 180 push-ups off of that chair. And while he was doing that, Brody was standing there talking to Larry and I, and Larry says, well, how was it in there with the champ? And he said, let me tell you something. He says, when that old guy gets your wrist, you're going to go wherever he wants you to go. And so, yeah, Lou was tops. And then I got to, when Lou passed away, I think I told you, Ed, his wife had actually sent his ashes, some of them, and Larry and I got to sprinkle his ashes at the back door of the Kiel Auditorium at the old Checker Dome location, and then at his house on Virginia Street where he used to live.
One thing I don't want to remiss, and we'll come back to the story of Lou. A couple of your chat people are putting up their chats, and one was talking about, watching it, this must-see TV and living it with their family. One of the things I talked about in the book is the excitement that it brought to so many people, mainly kids. And I can only imagine how much furniture was damaged and how many houses had dent marks in them from kids watching it and then putting on their favorite wrestler's move on their brother or somebody, and somebody going crashing across the table or chair or lamp broken or dented into the walls. I think that is, one of the high point memories you hear, because you wanted to go give that, whether it was the Iron Claw or whatever, you wanted to do that to your brother.
Well, and Lou, some of Lou's early matches actually took place in East St. Louis, Illinois, at the old Social Center, which was right down the street from the housing projects in East St. Louis. So that's where him and people like Pat O'Connor, Cowboy Bob Ellis, that's where they got their start, a lot of them.
But, one of the things, the best things coming from Lou, you just popped it into my head, Lou. I mean, Lou talked about what it really meant to wrestle at the Chase, because he talked about these cow palaces, gymnasiums, these dark, dank places. But he talks about, and I got it in the book, his quoting and things about it was different when you came to the Chase. You're in the Coruscant room. This is the same ballroom where they hold all the big high-class social events. and there's these very huge, iconic chandeliers that would hang down from the ceiling and hang down on the wrestling matches. So with all these people dressed to the nines, you're wrestling under these gorgeous chandeliers, and you're not into some dark, dank cow palace wrestling. And that's what Lou Thez says was one of the greatest memories of wrestling at the Chase.
Herb, you mentioned Bruiser Brody earlier with his match against Lou Thez. I know Ed is very familiar with him.
Yes.
I'll just give a plug right now to the Bruiser Brody Cup that I know, Herb, you're involved with, November 6th and 7th in Carthage, Texas. I'm also going to be there covering it for the Hannibal TV. But perhaps, Herb, for the fans that don't already know, you could explain a bit your relationship with Brody, and maybe Ed could share some memories of seeing him in action in St. Louis, which was one of his most popular cities.
Well, and his wife's cooperation, you might explain that too, Herb.
Yeah. My relationship with Brody, Frank Goodish, I was introduced to him by Larry Matisek again at the Belle Claire Fairgrounds back in the late 70s, early 80s, when I was running at the fairgrounds, running a monthly show there. And Larry would always show up to our cards, and he was helping me at the time. And we were using guys there, Dick Murdoch, Crusher Blackwell, you name them, the guys who were all big on TV. And Larry made a comment when I said, "Hey, what do you think about bringing Frank in here?" And I looked around and I said, Frank had never come to Belleville, Illinois. And he said, "Well, let me work on it." And, a few days later, I get the call from Larry, and he said, "Hey, Frank's in." And our relationship then became one that, and I'd heard all the horror stories that from other promoters. Oh, he'll stand you up. He'll do this, he'll do that. And so I get him booked on a card, and we got a couple of thousand fans inside of that metal building at the fairgrounds on a Thursday night. And it gets to be about 7:45, and the bell time's at 8:00, and I'm outside underneath the canopy. I'm waiting, and the parking lot's jam packed, and you can hear the fans in there just Brody. And Larry was picking him up at the airport for me. And I'm thinking, man, I hope all the rumors that I heard is not true about this guy, because I got a bunch of people in there mad. And it gets to be about 5 minutes to 8. My wife comes to the side door and she says, "Do you hear what's going on in here?" And I said, "Yeah." And she says, "Well, what are we going to do?" And I said, what are you going to do?" And about that time, I see this car pulling in the parking lot, and I'm focusing in. It looks like Larry's car. And sure enough, he pulls up to the side door, and this larger than life guy gets out and got his shorts on and his tennis shoes, and is putting his hair back in the rubber band. And he sticks his hand down. He says, "Big boy, I bet you thought I wasn't coming, didn't you?" And I said, "Nah, I didn't have to worry about it." But our relationship was great. Anytime I booked him on a card, he was there. He'd always walk in the dressing room and say, "Big boy, what do you want tonight?" And I'd look at him and I'd say, "Send him home happy." And boy, there wasn't a match that he didn't. The only show we ever that was ever produced at the fabulous Fox Theater in St. Louis, we did with him and Kamala, the Ugandan giant, Jerry Blackwell, Chris Adams. The midgets were on that card, the Fantastics. But he introduced me to so many of the guys that I worked with. Dory Funk, Terry Funk, people like that. So, and his wife, Barbara, after the tragic murder of him in 1988, he was actually with us the weekend before. I owned a bar and restaurant in Cahokia, Illinois, and we were celebrating our 1-year anniversary there. And he was our weekend guest that whole weekend. And people stood in line for hours to get in and get an autograph from him. And in fact, I have a picture of him standing outside of the tavern, one of those big inflatable Miller Lite cans, and him and I are standing there taking a picture. But and then a week later is when it happened, and I'll never forget that, August of 1988. So, but Barbara and I became good friends. We are good friends to this day. I love her dearly, and I'm just tickled to death that she's going to be in Carthage, Texas, with us on November 5th and 6th.
But and I think what you kind of said was he was larger than life. He was a hulk of a person, and but yet he had a caringness about him when he was outside the ring with people that you didn't always see from other um, wrestlers and things. And the thing that's interesting about uh, Brody and this whole history, you can, as I said, the wrestling at Chase went from 1959 to 1983, and you can kind of segment it because that crossed generations. I mean, that's what it does. It's different generations of memories in this thing, and you kind of can link on who was the person, the wrestler people remember at the early script, as you spoke earlier, Hannibal. It's the uh, Lou Thez, Pat O'Connor's, and then who was the other magnanimous one in the middle was Dick the Bruiser. You had Funks and all these other guys, but Dick the Bruiser was the one. And at the end, it's definitely Brody. I mean, we got pictures of people, and what an icon he was. I mean, one of the things I've got in the book is a picture of a guy at one of the events. He's got, if you look behind her, but the full face tattooed to his back of Brody. From the neck up there's this huge picture tattooed on this guy's back. And once you start exploring this stuff, it's not that uncommon. I mean, he was a legend to that generation and still is as people look back.
Somebody was wondering on here earlier if there was any feuds that didn't draw as expected in St. Louis that fans might be shocked by.
No, I mean, Sam was a master at giving the fans what they wanted to see. And as I said earlier, when we first started, I grew up with being an avid fan like everybody was, and seeing the way Sam booked. And then later on when Pat O'Connor had the book, and then Larry started getting it, they all knew you had to give the payoff to the fans. And it's kind of like what I say nowadays when I'm talking. The promoter, the booker, the matchmakers, it's all about like baking a cake. You got to have all those ingredients. And Sam always said, you treat the boys right, they'll treat you right. And then the beneficiaries of that are the fans. And I mean, from dating back to the Buddy Rogers days and Gene Kaniski, people like that. Fritz von Erich, probably one of the biggest heels in St. Louis back in the day. When Sam worked the storylines, the Kiel Auditorium, would seat 12,800 people, sold out capacity. And he had many and many of them. And I tell the story all the time. People say, well, Vince McMahon was the first ones that used to sell out arenas around the country. Well, I always beg to differ with that because I got all those records from the St. Louis statistics that they're on 3x5 cards that if you want to know how many matches Dick the Bruiser had, how many wins he had, losses, what the attendance was, I've got all those records along with all of the programs, and Ed has seen all of that stuff.
Well, you'll see them too because they're in the book. I took some of them just to show people. So somebody might say, hey, I saw Dick the Bruiser, I saw Brody, and there'll be a card for each wrestler, and then there's the dates they appeared. So it's like, hey, I can actually go back in time, and I remember when I was there sometime in like 1970. Oh, there it is, 1973, the summer, July, or whatever. You can find your place. But I think Herb answered it really well because, Sam, I wouldn't say he controlled everything, but he was not a controller. The way he operated, it was all laid out, and it's it was all accepting. Sure, there was going to be an upset every once in a while, but that is life. But as the heels versus the faces, all this back and forth. It was as Bob Costas, gave me his input in it because Bob Costas, was in St. Louis on doing sports announcing and radio shows during the high times of wrestling at the Chase. He said, it was this mighty clash of good versus evil. And, the fans were all behind whether they healed or the face. And at the end of the day, they all went home happy because generally good prevailed over evil. And, it's that one of the things you made me pop up to think, I tried to find all these. I love to do these little anecdote stories, and some people may not know this, but it's going to fall into play as I tell this story because it's throughout the world of wrestling then and the world of wrestling today. And Gorgeous George was uh, visiting out in Las Vegas when Muhammad Ali had just won in the Olympics and was starting his heavyweight boxing career. And Ali went to this wrestling match where Gorgeous George was wrestling, and he did his whole shtick, and he got on the air. I am the world's greatest wrestler, and the whole 9 yards. And if this guy can beat me, I'll crawl across the ring and he'd cut off my hair. But it'll never happen because I am the world's greatest wrestler. And Ali met him in the locker room after that match, and they talked about it. And voila, he was not Muhammad Ali at that time. He was Cassius Clay. But that shtick of I am the greatest, it began at a wrestling match with Gorgeous George. So those are the kind of little nuggets, I'll call them, of little tangents that, we want to bring to the life. Like I said, it was when did freeform wrestling evolve? That's all these little nuggets we try to find and bring them in there.
Well, Ed, you made a comment, Sam controlled, but he wasn't a controller. What we referred to him as was a peacekeeper. When you had all of this territorial days back then, which I wish was still around now, but that's a story for another day. But, Sam was the one who was getting those calls at midnight or 2:00 in the morning when Fritz was having problems or Crockett's was having problems with, what Sam did is controlled that NWA belt. And, but his theory was, here's a piece of pie and we're all going to get a piece of that pie first. And then whatever's left, we're all going to get equal shares of that also. And I think that's why Sam's, the respect that people had for him was based on his integrity.
Well, I think it was integrity. It was honesty. Everybody knew where they stood. I mean, the NWA and, with Pinky George started in 49, but then when Sam took over for the next several decades, he brought it and made it. Sam Muchnick is everywhere you look and read and when you do your research. He is compared to Pete Rozelle, who brought the NFL together. And that's what, as Herb said, Muchnick brought these territories of the NWA together and unified them into one champion, so each of them having their own champion. There was one, and he would wrestle in all the territories, but they would also rotate talent between the territories. So you always had fresh talent moving in instead of people having them in their own exclusive wrestlers in their own exclusive territories, and the fans got tired of it. It was this flow, and that is the beauty that built this golden age. And all that came back to this one man. And it's people like Herb has spoken of Joe Garagiola. I mean, Joe's brother Mickey was the ring announcer, and he was the court jester. I mean, and we got tons of stories of him. But not only did the Garagiola family participate in this book, and I've already mentioned Bob Costas. There's so many people that did. The Koppler family, who owned the television, the Koppler family, also owned the television network. Sam Muchnick's daughter and son heavily participated in it. So I mean, it's like everybody around the Midwest came to us with stories, with memorabilia. Because I mean, the other thing we don't do is we just don't have pictures of wrestling. We've got a lot of pictures of wrestling, but we go into memorabilia, little things, posters going back. There was one time Herb, in a statement I had him write in the book, he talked about watching this on Wednesday night. And I'm going, what? Well, everybody knows it was Saturday and Sunday, but no, I went digging and digging, and I found a big poster, and there it was, Saturday nights and re-aired on Wednesday evening. So when Herb was a little kid eating his Cheerios and watching TV, he was watching it on Wednesday night.
If Sam hadn't retired, do you think the St. Louis wrestling territory would have been able to withstand the WWE coming in and kind of destroying the territory?
Well, I'll give my answer first, and I'll let Herb add on to it. First of all, when Herb retired, he had been around for decades, and so I mean he was ready for retirement, aging out. Okay, but the sport was evolving too. Muchnick he actually started as a sports writer, a very renowned baseball writer for local newspapers, who had also covered wrestling under Tom Pax, who was a promoter here in St. Louis and across the country. And when he moved, Pax brought him over to get into his promotions. That's where he learned the wrestling game. He had his ways, and as I spoke, there is this evolution of wrestling. For thousands of years, the Greco-Roman stuff. 1904, we start the freestyle wrestling. It picks up a little bit of vaudeville, the entertainment, the action. And then, we had all these territories that were kind of run in that little, kind of circus format type thing of traveling in their territories. Brought under Muchnick, he ruled with a set of rules that Herb has spoken about. And, he wasn't for all the flair of things that you see today. And as it was starting to evolve, but see, at that point in 1980, the world is changing one more time. It's not the Roaring '20s. It's not the post-World War II era. All of a sudden, we've got two new key players evolving: video games, and pay TV. And all of a sudden, the popularity is happening of wrestling because it's being exposed on all these cable TV channels. Secondly, as we entered the 80s, we had this, as I said, video game era of, sensational video games and action. So people wanted to turn up the action. And it wasn't just in wrestling. It was every part of society in the 80s. And, I think that was something that really Sam was never going to bridge that. And that's where Vince McMahon came really in, and he very adeptly took that and just created the WWE empire from that, because he was the master who could bring it to the cable networks. He's the master who could bring it in this video-esque world. And then, pay TV, it was just money in the pot with that thing.
Well, and you're right, Ed. Father Time had caught up with Sam, and he was ready to go. And a lot of fans, probably viewers, don't realize that Larry Matisek had started his own promotion for a couple of years, and I was involved with that whole deal right when Vince was coming in. There was a big fight over the local channels, TV channels, and of course, how do you compete with a guy like Vince? And some fans may not know, Larry actually went to work for Vince McMahon for 10 years and worked for him. And so, yeah, Sam, there's nobody was going to withstand what Vince brought to the table back then. But I applaud Sam for getting out of it when he did, because like you just said, it was the time. It wasn't a good time, I can tell you. I feel that the wrestling, the way I grew up with it, died when that happened. But that's why we try to keep it going the way we do here at SICW, to try to keep that old tradition.
Yeah, and now it's really just a shell of itself. But as you said, there's some companies that are trying to get the old tradition back because those fans are still out there. But could you guys kind of go into the St. Louis territory a bit, how it worked? Because it was different than the other territories, as it was really just about St. Louis. I understand there may have been spot shows here and there, but there wasn't really anyone that like regularly could live off of just working in St. Louis. They'd fly them in, or they'd come in just for the shots. How often was it run, and how would it work as opposed to other territories such as Kansas City?
Well, and you're right, Hannibal. Everybody back or now assumed that Sam had this big territory that he controlled. And as I said earlier, he had St. Louis, and that, he didn't, that was it. And he may, through the Kansas City office, they together sometimes would run up into northern Illinois. They'd run up into Iowa, out to St. Joe's, Missouri, places like that. But for the most part of it, Sam was happy with St. Louis. Their TV that Ed talked about, and which they'll read in the book, is kind of what the concept we're starting back over again, is doing television tapings. And then they would fly these guys in for a show at the Kiel Auditorium, which was based on those TV shows, telling the story and building up to that big climax at the Kiel Auditorium. And then about twice a year, they'd have a big show at the Checker Dome that would seat about 20,000 people, and just have a big blowout there. But they would tape shows on a Sunday afternoon, either 4 or 5 weeks, depending on how those weeks fell, building up to that big show at the Kiel Auditorium. Many times, they'd fly Ric Flair in for a match at Kiel Auditorium, and then they would hold him over on Sunday, or whoever it may be, Fritz, or back in the early days. And then those guys, Dick the Bruiser, would come down from Indianapolis, and even back then, a lot of those guys worked them Sunday afternoon TV shows for little or nothing, because they knew that they were going to be a part of that 4 or 5 week buildup for the next big house show where they'd get the big payoff.
Yeah, I mean, it was that, just to clarify, we talked about Wrestling at the Chase being on Saturday nights and re-aired generally on Sunday, but there were those periods that it was on Wednesday. They were actually filmed initially on Monday nights, but to kind of cut costs of the guys who were coming in and doing a Saturday night show, they started taping them on Sundays. And then it was aired on Saturday. So it was just a phenomenal time. It was an innocent time. There wasn't the distractions. It's like, people would say, well, why did people watch wrestling? Well, back in the late 50s, early 60s, it's not like today where you turn on television and there's 500 channels operating 24 hours a day. There was just ABC, CBS, and NBC, and then you had the 1 or 2 independents. So when KPLR TV came on, they were station number 4. And television in those days also went off the air at 10:30 or perhaps midnight and didn't come back on until 5:30 or 6 in the morning. So, it was something special to see. It was something special to watch. And as I said, hundreds of thousands of people would be watching it, sitting by their television, whether they had popcorn and soda or popcorn and a beer or something. They were acting like they were those swells sitting at that table ringside. And inside the Chase, there was generally 800 to 900 people. So it wasn't like a small venue. It did hold that many, but there were hundreds of thousands elsewhere across the Midwest watching.
Chris Owens would like to hear you tell the story about Andre the Giant breaking some beer bottles in a bar when a fight broke out. Of course, Andre was a regular in that territory as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, he, of course, Andre's always referred to everybody as the boss. And, of course, and I'm sure Chris has probably heard 101 stories about all different types of wrestlers, but Andre was a peacekeeper in his own rights, just by the virtue of his size. And Larry told this story a lot of times when they'd go into the bar after a match at the local hotel where they'd be staying at, and there'd always be some rebel rousers in there that maybe it just came from the match, or maybe he'd been in there, and somebody would always want to challenge a wrestler. And of course, Sam's had a strict policy. Any trouble, I don't want the boys being involved. We don't want to be on the local newspaper of wrestlers being arrested or something like that. So that happened to one night. Guys are in there wanting to challenge. I can't remember who it was, but
they were giving the Fabulous Moolah a bunch of trouble too that night.
Yeah, and of course everybody loved Moolah, but and Larry was afraid that it was going to turn into something. And of course, they'd be in trouble. And Andre told him, says, boss, let me handle it. And walked in there and grabbed a couple of beer bottles and broke them down on the table and said, who wants to fight? And man, out the door, nobody wanted to mess with Andre. But a gentle giant, I'll tell you.
Well, I mean, he was just such a massive presence, at around 500 pounds. All I can ever think of back was that poor horse in that movie, The Princess Bride, that Andre the Giant rode. Can you imagine that horse when he brings the horses in the final scenes? But I mean, yeah, it was like, could you be thinking you were just a smart aleck in a bar and your only way out was through Andre the Giant?
No.
I think when you realize I just made a mistake.
Oh, yeah. Well, in Hannibal, one of the discussions that I've had over the years, fans will say, man, I used to go see Andre the Giant at Wrestling at the Chase. I loved going and seeing him. And I used to try to tell the fans, well, I hate to disagree with you, but Andre never wrestled at the Chase. He would be at the Keel and every now and then at the Checker Dome, but they would send from time to time clips in from other parts around the world when they were showcasing him against somebody coming to St. Louis. But Andre never actually wrestled inside the Chase Park Plaza.
Was that because he had a percentage of the gate? Sorry, was that because he would be working for a percentage and the tickets were free, so it'd be hard to afford them?
You really want to know why? You ain't going to believe this. He was too big. And especially at the studio setting, because then that's the other, when we talk about wrestling at the Chase, at the ballroom, at the Corsan room that Ed talks about and that everybody remembers, it was there for several years, but then they moved it into the TV studio at KPLR TV Channel 11, which was right behind the wall of where the Corsan room basically was. And it was a smaller, just a TV studio setting. A couple of hundred people would show up there for the TV tapings in, but Andre literally was just his massive size would not allow that.
And that what you're talking about there, and how Herb gave away one of the answers to the question. In the back of the book, after I tell this whole story, of the evolution of wrestling, the evolution of wrestling at the Chase, the transition to the WWE, some bios of the most famous wrestlers who participated. I do a couple things. I got a trivia quiz at the back about certain questions about the program. Herb gave it. Did Andre the Giant ever there? True or false? Then there's a couple dozen more questions that you'll take you back in memory and try to answer. Or who famous feuds you spoke of earlier. Feuds. Who were the famous feuds? What were the famous holds of certain wrestlers? So, I tried to go a couple different ways to make it fun, to make it, bring back memories. And, I think you're going to enjoy that part.
What was the best drawing feud of all time for the St. Louis territory as far as selling out the major arenas?
Man, there's so many of them, Hannibal. I'm telling you, way back.
By generation, by decade.
Yeah, I mean, it was some of the all-time greats. I mean, anytime Jack Briscoe was defending the title against Dory Funk Jr., Harley Race, you can't speak about wrestling in St. Louis without mentioning Harley Race and some of the matches he had against Ric Flair. So, like Ed said, and again, I can't remember in all my years of ever seeing a bad feud. That was one of the questions. Greg Gagne.
Some of these guys, not only did they change the feud, sometimes they transitioned from a heel to a face or vice versa, and then that set up additional feuds.
Oh yeah, as you know, Hannibal, being in the business yourself as a worker, you can change pretty quickly. And a good, smart promoter can recognize that. And boy, I tell you, Sam, I used to sit there and he always told me when I first met him, in fact, and I know where it was at the Fairmount Park Racetrack, eating dinner with him and Larry. Larry had took me there, and He said, Larry told me you want to know more about the business and get in it. And man, I'm sitting there with Sam Muchnick. I was in shock basically, and he was sitting there eating steak. He loved eating steak there, and he had this steak knife, and he took it, and I thought, what the, he's not cutting, he's holding it up, and he says, you listen to what I'm telling you. And he took that knife and he pointed it to his ear and he said, you keep these open, and he pointed it to his lips and he said, you keep this closed, you'll go a long way in this business. And he said, I told Larry the same thing. And he said, I'm telling you. And that has stuck with me all these years. And I just think that a good promoter, and Sam was, he knew I'd sit there when people like Gene Kaniski be sitting in the office, or Fritz von Erich, and they'd be talking about different angles that was getting ready to come up. And the guy could just, like he had a crystal ball, and I would just sit there like a kid at a candy shop. And I'll never forget that kind of education.
One thing too, just not to get too far from, like, Tony Smith asked a question about Lee Warren, a referee. I thought it was important that we talk about the wrestlers, their history, their bios, how many of them played professional football and things. What was their background, because of this athleticism they all had, men and women, But I also felt it important to talk about the announcers, as we spoke about Larry and Joe Garagiola, or the ring announcers. But we also do give a call out, shout out to the referees. So Lee Warren and all the others.
And his brother Ed, Lee and Ed Warren.
Yeah.
They refereed some of the main events there in St. Louis.
Right. Tony Smith had made a comment about Lee Warren was his high school gym coach. So Yep, and we talked about. We had one of them.
I talked to him all the time.
We had a guy that was a postmaster. Was one of the referees. We get into, they are just as much important, because you can't have a match without the referees. You can't have a television without the commentators or ring announcers. So we called out the whole thing to make it something very special, to create that memory, because not only is this the foundation for what you have today, for so many people, whether this is wrestling, it's baseball, what I have found is it triggers memories, and it's positive. And in a world, I can only tell you a story. This is going to be just a little tangent. I was at a party after my baseball book came out. It was on the St. Louis Browns. It got picked as the best book published on baseball in 2017. It was this Christmas party at kind of a massive one at this guy's house, and this guy comes up to me and said, "Are you the Browns guy?" And I said, "Wow, like, maybe, yeah, I guess." And all of a sudden he started crying. And his wife came up and says, "Is this him? Is this that? Yeah." And she starts crying. I go, "What the heck did I do?" And he's talking about how his dad has Alzheimer's. And his dad's in a home. He goes over there throughout the week and sits and watches TV with silence. He didn't know what to give him for Christmas, but he knew he loved the Browns baseball, so he bought him the Browns book. All of a sudden, the dad's eyes opened up. And remember, they just sit and watch TV quietly and don't have a conversation. And he starts pointing to pictures of ball players and calling them by name and telling stories. And this would go on and on. Every time he would go over, he'd get the book out. And he said, "I don't know if he knows I'm his son, but I just want to thank you for giving me my dad back." And I think these kind of books that we put together with these pictures and the stories, it doesn't have to be baseball. I think you're going to see the same thing of wrestling, that this is an opportunity to bridge generations with your parents, your grandparents, and talk about, do you remember this wrestler? Look at him, whether it's the big Hulk of Brody that we have out there, it could Joe Tangaro or, Luthez, any of them, Gene Kaniski, Ted DiBiase, they're all in there. You name them, they're in there.
I have to ask you, Herb, you mentioned being in the office for meetings with Fritz von Erich. We got a lot of Texas wrestling fans on this channel. Could you share any stories about the von Erichs?
The von Erichs was big here in St. Louis. Fritz was, like I said, at one time probably one of the biggest heels that Sam would bring in, and it was tough as nails. One of the trivia questions that's in the book, I won't tell them, but there is a trivia question in there about where Kevin von Erich was actually born at. And, Kevin is the only von Erich that is still living. I talk to him quite frequently, and he's got his two sons are wrestling now. And I think you're well aware of that, Hannibal. You're kind of involved with that organization. But Fritz was tough. Him and guys that he'd go against like Killer Kowalski. Back when you had legitimate shooters, as we called them. But David, I think, was destined to get that NWA title before his untimely death. I remember sitting at Kiel Auditorium the night when that announcement was made. Of course, that's just a terrible, terrible story with that entire family. And there's all kinds of different stories out there how the boys never wanted to be in wrestling, but the conversations that I've had with Kevin and other people that were around him just disputes those type of rumors.
And as far as the Missouri state title, everyone always says that was the title right before the world title, the second most prestigious, with maybe the Texas title being the third. What made the Missouri state title so prestigious?
It was Sam's idea because there was a dispute over that title. And Sam basically going back to him being the peacekeeper. And, at times you can make peace and at times you have to draw the line in the sand. And when he came up with that idea of the Missouri title, it sent shockwaves through the other territories that, hey, if you don't want to recognize what I'm doing here, I'll have my own Missouri state champion. And, a lot of the all-time greats held that Missouri title. And a lot of them were more proud of that than they were of that the heavyweight title.
Very good. And as far as Ric Flair, there's lots of clips of Ric Flair wrestling in St. Louis in the documentary you allowed me to post on here, Herb. Do you guys have any stories you can share about Rick and some of his great battles? I know he wrestled Brody at the Kiel at least once. I think I've seen that match.
Actually, wrestled Brody a couple different times, doing Broadways with him, and packed the place every time. Rick came to St. Louis, and that story was told by Larry Matisek. And Rick's even made comments that if it hadn't been for Larry Matisek, he probably wouldn't have got to St. Louis when he did. In fact, I remember the day that Larry got the films in from Crockett's and had it in the control room at Channel 11. And man, he was just in awe. And I was sitting over there, like I said, a kid at a candy shop. In fact, Larry and I drove over that day together. And he said, man, he went and got O'Connor, who was kind of running the book at that time, and brought O'Connor into the control room. And Larry told him, he said, man, this guy can put some butts in the seats. And O'Connor said, nah, he's too small. And O'Connor walked out, and I could see the look on Larry's face. He's, well, he don't know what he's talking about. He went and got Sam and brought Sam in, called him over. And Sam stood there for about 5 minutes and watched some of that match. And he looked at Larry and said, call Crockett and tell him I want him in here. And Rick tells that story to this day that Larry, thanks to Larry, that's how he got to St. Louis when he did.
Well, I think you're going to see a lot of this in the book, those stories. And then, we haven't mentioned, but coming out of this this book and the people's memories that come out of the book, and we'll be soliciting, and we'll come back to you, Hannibal, with some solicitation. But, later on this summer and early fall, we will be putting together, like we have done with my other books, to put together a companion film documentary where, the fans remember, the wrestlers remember, and we'll have some tapes of these great matches that we speak of, and go back and see what it was like in these days of black and white wrestling matches surrounded by people all dressed up. But, I think we'll have a very, very special documentary. And, I can say very humbly, I don't mean it from an egotistical way, but we know how to put them together. We know how to put the books together. They've all got awards. The films have Emmy nominations. We've won Emmys, and I look for exactly the same coming out of this wrestling project, where we'll reach out to people to give us your thoughts of wrestling and the golden years of wrestling. And Herb, I'll turn this question over. The best major heel matches in St. Louis.
Man, oh man. I mean, Hannibal talked about the Bruiser Brody, Ric Flair, but back in the day, I mean, like I said, Gene Kiniski, another big heel, Killer Kowalski, people like that, Buddy Rogers, some of the great matches between him and Pat O'Connor. I mean, I couldn't sit here if my life depended on it. I couldn't name just one. And I think that's because I've been such a big fan for all these years now. And then, as I told you, it's been such an honor to help Larry with his book. And then you come along with the same title of two titles. And these books are going to complement, and yours is just so much more in depth, I believe, with this coffee table book. But if somebody said you either got to tell me what that biggest feud was or you're in trouble, I guess I got to be in trouble because there's just so many of them.
Well, I want to clarify something. Larry did this book about 17 years ago, 18 years ago, called Wrestling at a Chase. But it's more of a word stories, his
Right.
stories, his favorite memories and stories, where the difference from this book is it's this coffee table book just loaded with pictures and stories. And, I hate always telling people the stories on the air because I tell them to buy the book, but I'll give you one quick. I mean, either Sam Muchnick or Garagiola, Mickey Garagiola, what they love to do is take the wrestlers back to the hotel after the matches. They'd get them in the car, and then they would find a mark, some young kid in his hot rod car acting real cocky, and so the old man pulls up, next to him and starts honking and flashing lights and shouting at this kid, and they're kind of get this back and forth till they get up to the next stoplight, and the young kid's going to go hop out of the car and teach the old man a lesson. So here comes the old man, whether either it's Muchnick or Mickey Garagiola, gets out, and then guess who gets out of the back seat? Gene Kiniski or Fritz von Erich or one of these guys, and that little young kid who thought he was such a hot shot quick jumps in the car, takes off. I mean, these are the little nuances outside the ring that bring humor and memories to all this.
Well, when you talk about those feuds, Johnny Valentine and Gene Kiniski, I mean, they don't come a lot tougher than those guys, Johnny Valentine especially. And I mean, the list of the who's who that, they may have been around the country on other territories, but man, when they got to St. Louis, they turned it up a notch because they knew they had to. They knew that working for Sam was it. He was the godfather, and they wanted to leave a lasting impression with him. They didn't want to end up like the Sheik. The Sheik worked St. Louis one time, and him and Sam was friends, but Sam said that style is not for me. And he told Larry, pay him and tell him I'll call him when I need him, and never came back.
Somebody without no name is on there, but he made a comment about Buddy Rogers, and we hadn't really talked a lot about Buddy Rogers until just briefly a second ago. When we talk about how Sam Muchnick made his name as a promoter, and as I said earlier, he started as an understudy of Tom Pax, learned the business there. And what happened was they had a feud and they broke off. And it was Sam's evolving relationship with Buddy Rogers, the original Nature Boy, not Ric Flair, who took the name, but Buddy Rogers. I guess you would say it was Buddy Rogers that really punched Sam Muchnick's card. Wouldn't you say, Herb?
Yep. Yeah. Well, and Buddy was a tough one himself. I mean, like I said, some of the great matches that I remember, him and Pat O'Connor had one of the biggest matches at Kaminsky Park, when he beat O'Connor in that 2 out of 3 fall.
An all-time
30,000, at Kaminsky Park. So, I mean, you can't, there's been a lot of Nature Boys out there, Nature Boy, Buddy Landell, people like that. But Nature Boy Buddy Rogers invented the strut, and he was a tough cookie. And
Well,
then there was issues, and I don't know if it got in the book, but when Buddy didn't want to go along with the program, who was it that Sam reached out for to try to get him in line was Luthez. And, that story, he kept dodging him. They'd book him, and Buddy would not show up. And because he had him against, and then all of a sudden they said, well, we'll get him. And they snuck Lou into the arena that night, and they announced Buddy, and here comes Lou with a hooded outfit on and got in the ring, and all of a sudden he's looking across that squared circle against Luthez, and Lou stuck his hand out and said, we're either going to do this the easy way or the hard way. Because, I mean, don't know if a lot of the viewers know, but Lou was a shooter. That's why when he wrote that book, tells a story about Luthez, because he's a guy that could come in and be the peacekeeper.
Well, you mentioned the Comiskey match. That's a good example. We got the program, not just the poster, but the program from that match. Those are the little pieces of memorabilia that I think people love to look at and just see. And that's right there in the book.
Yep.
There's a fan on here, Rick Brooks, that wanted to know if there was ever any major heel versus heel matches in St. Louis.
Well, and I think, and I keep going back to the Brody and Flair match, because, Brody could be either or. And, of course, we all know in the business that it's all in who you put the guy against. And, of course, Flair was always the heel against him here. And, I mean, the crowd would just – I remember the one match they had where they did a referee was really involved in that match, and Brody had won on the surface, but then a reversal happened. And when they reversed the decision on that, I mean, they filled that ring full of beer cups like you couldn't see the canvas because of all the beer cups were there. I mean, the referee, which was a gentleman named Ed Smith, who's not with us anymore, they had to escort him to the back with police security because everybody just thought that Brody had won that title that night, and of course it was reversed. But so again, that's probably again, that was Sam's way of giving the fans just a little bit, had them sitting on the edge of the seats, and then of course that sets up for a return match, and he was a master at that.
Well, I mean, and there are the times, probably one of my favorite stories, and I told you about Mickey Garagiola being kind of the Forrest Gump court jester type guy. There was a time where he got so excited in a match. It was a tag team match. Harley Race and DiBiase and two other members of the card, but Harley Race was the champion, and Ted DiBiase got him in the match. And all of a sudden the crowd's cheering, going nuts. Mickey runs up and says, "The new heavyweight champion of the world, Ted DiBiase." And Harley Race is on his knees looking up, screaming, "No, no, no, no." Because you could never do it, a televised match, B, you could never do it in a tag team match. But it was just one of those little precious moments in the history of professional wrestling that.
And that was one of the few times that I saw Sam leave the control room, because this was on TV, and man, he was livid. He came out of that control room and come down to ringside, and he would only make appearances down there if there was an angle that required it. But because Mickey got so caught up, like you said, he got caught up in that action. And Ted DiBiase tells it too. He says, "Yeah, I owe Mickey a lot." He said he made me a world champion one day on TV, and but Sam was telling Larry at the table, tell him, and Larry was a master at covering. We talk about the deans of announcers, and of course I'm partial to Larry Matisek and Mickey Garagiola. Those two were like peanut butter and jelly. I mean, they worked good together. And Mickey always told the story. My main job was that bell. I was told I had to protect that. And so and that was the other thing. If you watched any of those tapes that Larry and I reproduced, there was only a few of the guys that were allowed to get out of the ring. Sam's theory was people come to see wrestling inside the ring, but guys like Dick the Bruiser, Dick Murdoch, Bruiser Brody had a kind of a free pass, and they could get a little crazy and wild. But Mickey would say, my job is he'd keep one foot down off of that little riser they had him sitting on. And when he'd see him get thrown out of that rope, he'd grab that bell and he was heading towards Lindell Boulevard because Sam told him, don't let nothing happen to that bell.
And that bell is right here in my office, and you'll see it in the book and the upcoming movie. You'll hear it one more time.
Amongst all your awards that you have back there, maybe you could share with us. You mentioned it a few times. Some of the film and book related awards that you've won.
Well, one of the books, we had the best book published in baseball in 2017. We had nominees also for Saber, which is a very select baseball thing, is the book of the year. My most recent book last summer that came out was picked as one of the top 25 books of 2020 here through the different newspapers. The films that we've done that have been shown on PBS all received different types of awards, Emmy nominations and Emmy awards wins. So, it's a lot of hard work, but it's also very humbling, and, to take this kind of a little bit of a tangent, because, I've mainly written in the world of baseball, and I've spoken multiple times in Cooperstown at the Baseball Hall of Fame. And when the virus was starting to play at the beginning of 2020, and everything was shutting down, and the film we were working on was shutting down, and a couple of those, because I always got multiple projects going at the same time. It helps me keep my head together. The two projects I was working on for books, I couldn't get into the libraries, the archives, and I was able to hook up to with Herb about this legendary show, these legendary wrestlers, and how they touched the lives of people. And I can't tell you what it's like to walk around, in St. Louis now. Things are opening up. I've done a couple book signings for Father's Day in the last couple weeks to help out some stores. And I was there, and I had a big poster coming fall 2021, Wrestling at the Chase. And as you've put that picture up there several times, with the graphic of all these wrestlers and things. And, it's like everybody sees that they want to come over and tell you of a memory, of a story. And I've told you a few, about the grandmas, this or that, or what it was like. And, and I spent one of the funny things is, I spent so many hours just reading newspaper from the 1930s up through, the 1990s. I would just read article after article going through online newspaper archives. And one of the funniest was one of the referees he said, I just got to tell you, and this was an interview in the newspaper, I have given up on women. I sit in the ring, and they are the most bloodthirsty, hateful, voluminous women. All they want is blood. And, I read that, and it was like, huh. And I started going back and listening to the tapes. And I'll tell you what, the loudest people on those tapes are women. And it was really kind of like an interesting tangent, because I like these little tangents because I think people find interest in it. And like I said, I felt that I have gained a lot in my life. And one of my ways of giving back is I go to nursing homes and retirement homes. And I will use probably 2 or 3 times a month I've been doing this for over 5 or 6 years, just to go and talk about, like, the history of this baseball team or World Series or whatever. And last week, it was the first time I went into a facility since probably almost a year and a half, almost 2 years, because of the pandemic. And, I was giving this talk on the St. Louis Browns, and I mentioned wrestling at the Chase. And as I spoke about earlier about the person with the Alzheimer's lighting up, all these people started lighting up in their eyes about remember wrestling. It just this was the golden age of wrestling. You didn't have all these other distractions. You didn't have all these other forms of entertainment. Even back in the 1920s and 30s, there wasn't that many types of entertainment, and wrestling was this kind of carnival atmosphere that Muchnick brought into this really controlled special thing, just like Roselle in the NFL. And it means so much, these memories, and just to be able to go and I always say, will you come, but what do you charge? I don't charge you anything. I'm here to give people memories, and that's what I that's what I enjoy. Not the awards, not the special recognitions. It's making a guy think I've given him his dad back, or letting people eyes twinkle as they remember sitting watching wrestling at the Chase, or wrestling in Kiel or Checker Dome, or even wrestling from the Marigold in the early 1950s. There's something about taking people back to remember the good parts of their life.
We always hear that the Kansas City territory was one of the low-paying territories. We hear St. Louis was always known for good payoffs. What, on average, maybe if you could share, maybe in the 70s and 80s, what would like a main eventer make as opposed to an opening match guy working the St. Louis on a big card?
Ed, do you have anything like that in the book?
We've got some. We talked about how Kansas City was over there, and there were attempts to come over and rob. But we really tried to stay at the national. We didn't get into depth, talking too much about each of the individual territories, because we wanted to really focus. Sam was really. We talked about he was in charge of the St. Louis Wrestling Club, but he was really in charge of the NWA and how it worked. I mean, we highlight, and you'll see little bits of stories about each of the different territory heads, and like Vince McMahon Sr., Vince's dad. He ran the territories up in the Northeast, and so we point out that the different promotions out of Chicago, Kansas City, down in Texas, with Von Erich and all these things. But we try to, I could have put all the stories, I could have put all the wrestlers, I could have put all the matches, and the book would have been 3,000 pages, and to make it profitable. And that in my publisher, we try to keep it in the 225 page realm, and it's a big book, 11 by 11, brilliant pictures, and it's something I'm very proud of this. I mean, the more I got into it in the research, especially when you're stuck in your room, and Herb brought all this stuff to me from Wrestling in the Chase, and I would sit hours all night because I was just so focused, grilling through things online, especially archives of history of matches to get it right.
Well, I can tell you, Hannibal, Sam paid percentage at those house shows, and the talent that was in the Kansas City offices there, the Art Cruzes, the Roger Kirby's, Bob Sweetans, and people like that. They begged to come to St. Louis because of the difference in the pay. And over the years, when I've talked to guys like Butch Reed, God rest his soul, he couldn't wait when he would get to St. Louis. But Kansas City was a place that they needed some good talent. Bob Geigel, and Bob Brown, and them guys were out there. But the whole moral of that story is that St. Louis, like we say, the Chase was the place, and Sam took care of the boys real good in St. Louis.
Last question I'll bring up for you guys tonight, because you've been generous with your time, is Harley Race. We've never really talked about. I spent about 2 weeks training with him. I'm a big fan of his. Any stories about him and his legendary toughness?
I can tell you, Harley, one of the greatest of all times. The real quick story, I had a barbecue restaurant business in Cahokia, Illinois, and I had him in for an autograph signature. And of course, inside this restaurant, I had a lot of the wrestling memorabilia up on the walls. I had a TV in there playing all the old tapes that I have. And I was on a Saturday afternoon. I had Harley come in, and him and his wife back then, BJ, she came with him, and people were lined out the door, down the street, waiting to see the toughest guy wrestler on God's green earth. And I had picnic tables in this barbecue restaurant, and Harley was sitting at the table, and the TV was up over his head. And we always had wrestling on. And so Harley's sitting there signing autographs. You know, he was always slow at signing, in between signing and smoking. And I'm standing at the counter, and I'm looking up at the wrestling. I'm looking at the crowd. And when I look up at the TV, lo and behold, it's Harley Race against Dusty Rhodes. And right away, I know what match this is. This is the match when Dusty takes the title away from him. And I'm thinking to myself, how embarrassing this, because all the fans that are standing in line are watching this match. And I thought, uh-oh. So I come out from behind the counter, and I'm trying to nonchalantly walk over to get behind Harley to reach up and eject that tape and put something else on. And I get over behind him, and I just get ready to hit the eject button, and he looks up at me and he says, "Big boy, if you turn that off, you and I are going to have a problem." And they sit there and watch the finish of that match. And I mean, Harley was a great, great, great guy, and I miss him dearly. He could be tough.
I think that's a key part, what you just said. I mean, we got pictures of that match in the book, but you know, we had a lot of film of interviews of guys like Harley who aren't with us today, and the others. And you know, when you write something like this that you feel really good about, boy, I wish Harley Race would be here to read the book and, you know, give me his thoughts. You know, because we tried to pull his stories from not only the tapes of the matches, but also his personal interviews.
And another quick story, Hannibal, when Harley was writing his book, I remember his wife called Larry and I, and was in a panic and said, "You're not going to believe this, but all these years, Harley didn't keep a lot of photographs. And he's got this book in progress, and they need some photos. And we know Herb's got a lot of photos. Can we borrow some?" So there's a lot of photos in Harley's book that Larry and I loaned to them to do that because, you know, just out of friendship. And there was a time when Larry and Harley didn't get along. In fact, we helped patch that up there towards the end, and Harley came to a couple of our shows, and him and Larry got to reunite.
Yeah, I don't see Harley being the type of guy going around asking for pictures with other wrestlers in the dressing room.
No, not Harley.
So to close this up, is there anything you guys want to promote? I know, Herb, you have this big Halloween show coming up October 30th with Haku, who is one of Harley's favorites, and of course the big Bruiser Brody Cup in Carthage, Texas, November 5th and 6th, where you're getting your big award. So congratulations on that. I hope that we get to air that ceremony on the Hannibal TV, because we are going to be covering that. So who knows?
I hope so. And the only other thing, I always try to get a plug out there. Of course, the book, we plugged that quite a bit tonight, and I'll let Ed do that. But don't forget the Cauliflower Alley this year. We're all going to be out there. I've been honored to receive the Red Bastine Award this year. It was going to be last year, but with the COVID, everything got canceled, as everybody knows. But I'm really honored, thanks to Brian Blair and the CAC group. It's a great organization. I've seen them work miracles with the men and women in our business that are falling on hard times. And if there's anybody out there that's in the wrestling business, for $25, a year membership or $300 lifetime membership. And if you're a fan, your money goes to a great cause. So just go to the Cauliflower Alley website, and it's got all the information on there.
And, and I would add to that, I hopefully everybody found this a very enjoyable evening of stories and memories, and hopefully they'll buy the book, and maybe Hannibal, we can get back when the book comes out and people have kind of gone through it and give us their thoughts and give us some more stories, and maybe they will be someone we want to hook up with for our film that will be this history of the golden years of wrestling. So
for sure, we'd love to have you back on whenever the book comes out at the end of October, which will be closer to the other events Herb is involved with. But Southern Illinois Championship Wrestling is Herb's company that you guys can search up. And there is going to be some content of theirs on this channel as well to help give it some more exposure. So we're looking forward to that. And I'll let you two close it off however you want. I'm looking forward to reading the book myself, Wrestling at the Chase. And when it does come out, I'll be happy to plug it for my fans on the news.
Yeah, I'm just thankful that you had us. It's been very enjoyable reliving these memories, and hopefully based on these talks, maybe some guys, when they hit their heads to their pillows tonight, they'll go back and have some dreams and memories of the past.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed.